Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson, and if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate the show. That helps people to discover it on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, and it's also on Rumble. Enjoy the episode.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, Dr. James Fleming, I do appreciate you joining me today.
Great to be here, Ryan.
Yeah, I've been exploring your work, and I ended up reading your book, Fixing the Sky, and watching, an older book of yours, I suppose. And then I started to listen to a bunch of your online lectures and reading your blog. And it's something that I realized I don't know enough about, but you've spent a lot of your life studying the history of science and climate science, really. And you're probably one of the people that spent the most amount of time in this field. And I thought it would be nice for the audience and for people to be exposed to someone who has this nice grounded and rational approach to thinking about it, because I don't think most people even have a clue about the history of this subject matter. And so it would be just nice to hear a lot of your essence of your life's work and share some of the key points with people like myself and the general audience. So,
well, that's quite an opening. I had the book you're referring to is Fixing the Sky, 2010, and I have had any number of feelers toward putting out a new edition. And there's not that much new. The people are it's still a checkered history. It's still full of great ideas, but not so practical. Well, I'm in Pennsylvania. I'm looking at Mount Nittany near Penn State University, and I was born about 90 miles from here. And we decided to move here from Maine about 3 years ago. So in my hometown, I was fascinated with astronomy and meteorology. First of all, astronomy. Then on cloudy nights, it was meteorology, and I went to the university here in astronomy. And in 3 years, after 3 years, I had no more courses to take in that field. So I could have taken basket weaving, but I decided to take a suite of really challenging courses on geophysics and meteorology. And I studied with some of the best people really in the world. From that point, I got my degree in astronomy, but I went to Colorado State University to study atmospheric science. It was the time about the first Earth Day, and I wanted to be more relevant, and I came in from outer space into the Earth's atmosphere and decided I would study those phenomena, which have the same laws. It's just a lot more approximate, a lot more complicated kind of phenomena right here, because you're in the middle of a turbulent atmosphere on a tilting, rotating Earth that has all these seasons and seasonalities. And when I got into the Colorado State, I worked on radiative transfer. That is the transfer of sunlight and infrared radiation through clouds. And they had a great founder. Their founder, Herb Reel, was a really world-famous tropical meteorologist. You wouldn't think of tropical meteorology in Colorado, but I worked on the role of cirrus clouds in a tropical atmosphere. And it could have been like, it's one of these ancestors of climate modeling, because we modeled how the clouds were affecting the heat budget. And I got credentials to fly an instrumented aircraft. And we went up and measured stuff, and I did a computer program and came out successfully. I mean, with a strong reputation in atmospheric science with a master's degree, and then went to Seattle, University of Washington, where they had an instrumented aircraft program. And I think they liked me most because I didn't throw up on the airplane, and I was able to take measurements as we flew through clouds. And the big project out there was involved with cloud seeding and whether it was working or not, whether the so-called silver iodide chemicals were making it rain or what they were doing. And we never tried to make it rain. We tried to understand what the other people were trying to do by making new instruments and measuring new things. And to make it really short, I was on an instrumented World War II aircraft surplus aircraft, and our instruments were hung underneath the fuselage, and we flew out of a regional airport only when the weather was bad. So we flew all night long, turbulent, incredibly bumpy. Coming back home, it's still bumpy, and I was in charge of the navigation. So I noticed the pine trees were coming up on each side of us because it was a regional airport. It wasn't a very big airport. And I said, basically, I got on the horn. I said, brace for impact. And we cut off the top of a pine tree with our instruments.
Wow.
Just so close. I had a 1-inch branch in one of my particle collectors.
Mm.
1 more meter lower, we could have tipped the plane over. And so as I pulled out the branch, I said, "Gee, I got to find some new way to engage with the atmosphere because this is too dangerous. This is too rough.
Yeah.
Uh, this is too much." And so I at that point, I took a second course towards humanities, and I went to Princeton University as a history candidate and did my work on history of atmospheric science. The faculty was rather traditional. They said, "Do you want to do Newton, Darwin, or Einstein? Maybe Copernicus?" I said, "No, I'm going to do atmospheric science." So there's no Nobel laureates. It didn't have a history really,
Mm.
and I found a niche. Oh, this was back in the '80s. I found that niche that was my ecological field of study where I could make a big difference in the history of meteorology. So
Wow.
that's like the short course coming out of rural Pennsylvania into Princeton, and then I went to the Smithsonian, did a PhD. It was very well received by those people and by Princeton, and then I came to Colby College for 33 years as a faculty member, and now post classroom, post administration duties, I'm in. Again, looking at Mount Nittany in Pennsylvania, and kind of back home, working on stuff like your podcast.
Yeah. No, it's awesome. I love this format too. I feel like this is one of the quickest ways to extend your message and your research to people, and it's one of the fastest growing ways of just accessing information quicker. So, and a lot of times, especially now, there's a lot of fear mongering and just conspiracy and all the craziest stuff that's getting amplified out there about this field and every other field in particular. So it's nice to try to weed through all that and find people that have spent decades understanding the history and the actual truth behind it. And with you, from what I've gathered, and I'd love to get into this, the underlying threads that I've seen has been that the people that are doing a lot of the climate manipulation or whatever you want to call it have a very big lack of understanding of the history. And with any kind of implementation of technology, if you don't understand the history or the complexity of the scenario that you're trying to impact, there's all these unintended consequences. And so instead of it being a quick jump to conspiracy or nefarious actors, what I've gathered is that it's just a bunch of people. The human condition is we have huge egos and we have a lack of perspective. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, one of the themes of that work, and I've worked on weather control ever since Colorado State. One of the themes is kind of hubris, that we think we can control, the vast atmosphere outside. We can control our local environment. I just set the mini split on 70 degrees here, but we can't control the atmosphere of the planet. Although people think that they have ideas on how to do that, people tend to jump from basic, minimal understanding into control. They try to make sort of jump the shark to get some, in my understanding, some wild idea that could maybe make a difference, but it's really not really thought through.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about some of the motivational reasons why people do jump so quickly to wanting to control the climate and why global warming and some of the perspective shifts that have evolved over time have gotten so prevalent, I guess you could say, and a lot of fear around it? And then get into some of the examples that were somewhat catastrophes throughout history.
Sure, that's a real big setup. The the people that think they can control the weather. Some of them, I'll give you a historical example. Irving Langmuir got his Nobel Prize in surface chemistry for making kind of a better light bulb with General Electric. He worked in de-icing studies and how to make smoke screens during the World War II effort, and was cleared with his team to work on the Manhattan Project. But he never worked on the bomb. He got this idea that small particles of this nucleating agent could cause a chain reaction in cumulus clouds. And one of his early papers is called Chain Reactions in Cumulus Clouds. So he thought it's kind of like slow neutrons. They might generate a massive amounts of energy, the equivalent of a thunderstorm being the same amount of energy in it as an A bomb, a hurricane being multiple H bombs. And at the time, in 1946, 47, even the Strategic Air Command generals were saying if you control the weather, you can control the world. You could prevent the enemy from flying. You could fly when you wanted to. You could probably redirect hurricanes if we knew what we're doing. We might have a digital computer that would show a perfect forecast so you know exactly what's happening. And you could even deploy your field projects ahead of the storm. None of those things worked out. There's this thing called the chaotic limit for forecasting, and but there was a lot of high hopes for technology, and there was a lot of high hopes for control. The basic attitude, I think, is perennial. It goes back to the ancient literature, where controlling the weather, being like Zeus or being like Odin or being in the heavens, controlling the weather was an aspiration that humans wanted to reach, kind of like overreaching. And I in my book, I traced that kind of thread up into the 20th century with a whole lot of people I called sort of like some of them were charlatans trying to sell their wares commercially. Some of them I thought were sincere, but overly simplified and somewhat deluded scientists who had one idea that would change the world, but they hadn't thought through the whole complexity of it. The Earth system's really complex, and
Yeah.
really there's lots of different factors, not just one.
Yeah. It reminds me of the way we think of even biology in general, our bodies, and people want to just quickly take some new form of drug or supplement and not realize how complex nature is and how complex biology is. And when you look at climate, you know better than probably anybody how complex it is when you start to tinker with one element and you get all these unintended consequences that you probably can't even measure because it's a living system. And you brought up some incredible examples that I don't think 95% of people in the general public even realize we've ever done throughout history. And it sounds incredibly nefarious. Like Operation Popeye is one example, or the time we tried to rip the atmosphere open, or the ozone layer. And there's all these crazy examples of things we've actually done or tried to do that it seems insane that anyone had the legality to even get away with doing such things.
Well, we got caught with Operation Popeye. That was in 1967 through about 1971. And they tried to make extra rain over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam. Um, the pundits said, "Oh, let's make mud, not war, and let's slow down the trafficability." But they got caught as a secret project that really only the president and the Secretary of Defense really knew about it. They were telling the local air base commander, just shoot these flares out when it looks cloudy, and then they were claiming great results. So it's another technique in weather control is sort of to preserve deniability. You claim success, but you can't prove it. So they didn't have any rain gauges. They
Hmm.
didn't know that they were making that any difference at all. But it got caught up in the Pentagon Papers. It got put into the press by investigative reporters like Jack Anderson and Seymour Hersh. And it went to Congress, and this is about 73, and it ended up with a kind of a widespread ban on weather modification in the 70s. All the weather mod since then has been local or statewide, not national. But the big thing is that the Russians jumped on it. This was during the Gerald Ford caretaker presidency. They took it to the UN and they passed a treaty with other nations called the Environmental Modification Ban as a Weapon of War. It's called NMOD, capital ENMOD. And it brought cloud seeding, which is it's a technique that's not shown to be completely effective at all. It brought it into the same category as really nefarious things like Agent Orange and cookie cutter bombs in the jungle and bombing the North Vietnamese dikes, irrigation system, and other defoliants. So we got caught up in a really a mess involving environmental warfare.
Wow.
And the result was we got embarrassed and we got a treaty, which is still in effect. If any nation would try to wage war with rain or drought or severe storms, it could trigger this NMOD convention. So it was really quite a mess.
Yeah, and I'm curious, what were some of the biggest examples that you could list for people that have never read your book, and just examples about the really terrible, bad examples of things we've tried to do, like the Van Ryan belt was one of the ideas I've heard about, trying to destroy it.
Van Allen, right.
The Van Allen belt, I'm sorry.
I did a study of James Van Allen, who has the magnetosphere around the Earth. Parts of that name for him is called the Van Allen radiation belts. And he designed the first U.S. satellite after Sputnik. That was Explorer 1. And then there was another Explorer satellite. And I often ask people, I said, what do you think was the first instrument in space? Sputnik had a radio and it went beep, beep, beep. But Explorer had instruments on it. And the question is, what was on Explorer? A lot of people don't come up with this, but it was a Geiger counter, because they were showing that the solar wind was being trapped in the magnetosphere, and it was making space radioactive. There's actually a famous picture of Van Allen's blackboard back in the 57, 58. And the blackboard says, space is radioactive, and there's an arc of radioactive particles above our heads. Well, the military thought that was pretty interesting. So they decided they wanted to make it more radioactive for experimental purposes, also for national defense. This is the height of the Cold War. It's a couple years before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Van Allen, who had discovered this phenomena, that the Earth had a magnetosphere, within a couple months was in a project to detonate A-bombs in the magnetosphere to see if they could make it more radioactive. And so above the South Atlantic, they shot 3 A-bombs off. And the idea was to make sort of an EMP, electromagnetic pulse that would destroy communication. In case you had an incoming enemy missiles or aircraft, you could actually launch a bomb above your own cities and destroy the incoming attack. That was the theory.
Wow.
The bigger theory was, then why don't we try H-bombs? Let's do it in the Pacific. And in 1963, they detonated a giant H-bomb in the magnetosphere called Project Starfish Prime. You can find it online. It wiped out communications all across the Pacific for about 48 hours.
Wow.
Which was one of the goals, so that if there was a war a hot war was starting, you wanted to black out communications. Johnston Island was the place that was launched, and there was no communication with Johnston Island after it was launched. And 48 hours later, the Pentagon got through by radio. And the first message was, "Are you still there?" They thought maybe they had incinerated the island.
Jeez.
It ended up making what I called a aurora tropicalis, a giant light show in the tropics. Not like aurora borealis, but this was a giant set of electromagnetic flashes and flares and light show that was across the Pacific. There's a lot more to it, but the idea was if you were at risk of having enemy ordnance exploding on your cities, it probably is better to have your ordnance up above the city as a shield. So they
Mm-hmm.
were trying to make an electromagnetic shield above the city, and they was also trying to make a sort of a an effect that would transmit throughout the magnetosphere over across the world to other sides of the world. So if you could detonate this device, this atomic bomb in the South Atlantic, theory was it might affect Moscow half a world away.
Mm.
And then you
Yeah.
could deny it. Say, oh, no, no, we weren't trying to ruin your communications or anything. We were just testing some things in the South Atlantic. So there was this idea about deniability and
Mm-hmm.
about using the new technologies, computers, rockets, nuclear weapons, to try to not just modify, but try to control the atmosphere. And
Yeah.
not just the surface weather, but because meteorology went from surface measurements to jet streams, outer space. Now it's meteorology, atmospheric science deals with everything from the surface of the earth to the surface of the sun.
Mm.
And so in that realm, there were all these kind of proposals on how to control that environment, control the environment, you can control the world.
It's incredible. And like trying to rip a hole in the ozone layer was one of the examples I remember you mentioning.
That's right.
Well,
Um, you want to hear about that a
just
bit?
like, yeah, I want to hear about that. Like, what was the intention behind that and what the hell were they thinking?
Well, initially it was a good intention by a distinguished space scientist, earth scientist named Sidney Chapman. And as the International Geophysical Year was coming on, they realized that perhaps there are wavelengths where the astronomers couldn't view the stars through our atmosphere. And one of the things blocking that viewing was the ozone layer. It's not the kind of modern ozone ideas now, but Chapman came up with an idea to use chlorine and bromine in modest amounts to poke a hole in the ozone layer and announced when he was going to do this so that the astronomers could look through that lack of ozone and see new phenomena in outer space. So it was a scientific experiment in a day when anything goes. We can try this. We don't have to tell anybody. We just poke a hole in the ozone layer with our bromine. They had a so-called bromine bomb. And then it developed again. The military got this idea that we could make a bromine bomb and detonate it over Moscow, and cause ultraviolet radiation to flood into the city.
Hmm.
It developed into when we were trying to develop the what became the shuttle program with lots of rocket launches. They were going to launch. They were going to launch hundreds of rockets most every day to measure the upper atmosphere. Then they realized that the rockets were leaving debris behind them. They were leaving spent fuel, and they were causing a chemical reactions that would hurt the ozone layer. That's why the SST international plane was canceled. They thought it would be too damaging to the ozone.
Wow.
And so all this is way before the more or less well known study of ozone depletion that developed the Molina, Crutzen, and the Nobel Prize that came out of the 1970s. This was in the 60s. They knew what they were doing, but they didn't have any constraints, and there was real concern about ozone depletion. It was Rowland, Molina, and Crutzen, and those were the three scientists who got share of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their ozone chemistry.
Mm. Can you speak to the Beijing Olympics and what went on there? I found that to be interesting. I don't think most people I've ever talked to would know about that.
Right. Well, U.S. is not the only nation that has aspirations to influence the weather. I call it weather influencing or weather intervention. Beijing government decided they would develop a cadre of artillerists. And if you take and this has a history too. I mean, if you take a basic rocket and put a silver iodide nose cone on it, you can shoot it at a hailstorm and try to modify the hailstorm. They decided that they would get literally thousands of people trained with artillery weapons, and they would put, instead of putting explosive ordnance on it, they would put silver iodide nose cones on the ammunition. So they tried that, and they thought they could make it snow. They thought they could bring in more moisture. But the main thing about the Beijing Olympics was that they shut down industry in Beijing. They by fiat, they just said you're not going to have any more factories running during the Olympics, and that in itself
Wow.
reduced the pollution load and made it kind of nice. But then they claimed it was because of their artillerists.
Mm.
I was in Beijing 10 years ago for a series of history lectures, and I almost turned around when I got there because it was the worst pollution event that I'd ever felt, and one of the worst they ever had. You could smell the sulfur in your hotel room,
Wow.
and you couldn't see down the street. But about 2 days later, a big cold front came down from the north, from the mountainous area north of Beijing, and just cleared everything out. And it was cold and windy and very, very nice. So often the weather control people, they take advantage of some of those natural changes in the weather, but they claim success for their techniques having caused it. And I think that's pretty much what happened in Beijing.
Mm.
There's the central government shutting down factory production and taking cars off the street.
Hmm. And what about now? Like things have evolved and technology's gotten exponentially better. And I feel like there's more of a centralization of power. So people are able to do things like, say, like an Elon Musk is able to deploy his technology so quickly, it's hard to keep up with regulatory processes and understand what the unintended consequences are of even creating things, let alone trying to fix the mess that we make as we're creating things. What do you see as like the current issues of our time as far as exponential technological progress goes and not realizing the messes that we're making there? And then also, what are some of the current ways that we're trying to fix the mess that we're making that are not quite understood well enough?
Right. Well, there's always been the concern about the one-off, or some would say rogue actor, that if a billionaire wanted to shoot stuff into the stratosphere, they might just do it and not have to ask. Because now we have all these private companies that have their own rockets.
Hmm.
Uh, that's really a great concern. I don't. I think there's. I've been involved in some you know, governance issues, and there's a field of climate intervention that is not governed. I don't think much at all. There were some attempts to do that. There was a bill in Congress as early as recently as this last summer to try to ban all weather modification, but that's not going to go anywhere. Um, how do you constrain somebody who just wants to try something? And again, I'm a historian, and I think about like Jules Verne's book, The Master of the World. He developed the first airplane, and he tries to control the world and bomb other people. Or The Purchase of the North Pole is another Jules Verne book, trying to buy. This is very contemporary. Trying to buy the North Pole and then melt it. Trying to melt it. That's the essence of that story. How were they going to melt it? They were going to shoot gigantic cannons at the equator and tip the Earth to vertical tip. And somebody said, "Well, what if you suddenly tip the Earth? Wouldn't that slosh all the southern oceans and drown everybody?" He says, "Oh, that's down in the south. Let's not worry too much about that." So there's a
God.
lack of interdisciplinary thinking, and I've been a big advocate for what is called interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and international kind of discussions about this, because somebody like a rogue billionaire or one of Jules Verne's protagonists. There's a lot of literature on this in history too, a lot of fiction on this. without controls, people might try that because of the hubris factor, because of the perennial desire to be sort of playing God with the climate, playing God with the weather.
Hmm. Yeah,
There's
it
no,
seems.
yeah,
No, just it seems to be happening too. We have such a smaller group of people with so much more money now, and they are doing that to essential, like with the AI and deploying satellites and rockets, like you're saying, and vaccines, and you name it.
that's right. I have a colleague, he's a very distinguished colleague. He wrote a book called The Code of Codes. And this is about DNA, the discovery of DNA, and how the DNA is coding all of our, it's almost like deterministically determining what, predicting in a way what would happen to you. And, uh, and that's a nasty thing to think that one large molecule in your body can determine your whole future. I call it molecular reductionism, and you have some examples of this with U-235 that was going to that did change the world with the atomic bomb, plutonium. You know, one molecule, DNA. In my case, it was silver iodide, and you try to put all of your concerns onto one microscopic thing, and then you have these macroscopic concerns about the future and about society. So I think that's an important theme to think about. You can't reduce that complexity down to one thing.
Right. So right now with your current, I mean, you wake up every day, you've got limited amount of time on the planet and you want to have the biggest impact. And after all of the learning that you've done and your perspectives that you've gained, what is it that you think is the biggest bang for your buck return to focus on? I know you're an optimist and you want people to be motivated and not be nihilistic and to buy into the fear mongering and just give up. So what is it that you're trying to infuse into future generations?
Oh, I've been infusing this message that that you don't have to buy into the gloom and doom of we're all going to die because of certain environmental situations. I taught a lot of environmental science, and the younger generation will take some of that stuff and run with it, and they'll say, "I'm not going to have kids. I'm not going to have much of a future. The world's going to hell." In the meantime, they have longer lifespans, better health, better nutrition. Um, it's more complicated than a simple message, but we get simple messaging, and I hope this isn't a simple message either. But I'm trying to say it's a complex thing, and and you can't reduce the future to climate change. You can't limit your future if you're 18, 20 years old. I mean, there's so you can continue to aim high and make the world a better place. That's kind of like one of my messages.
Yeah. And what is your perspective on the current situation with climate change and thinking about it as the great threat to humanity? Is it something that is being somewhat propagated as a means for making trillions of dollars for certain companies and they want to use that as a fear mongering? Or is this something we should truly be pretty concerned with and we should actually be trying to engineer solutions for?
Yeah, I'm a moderate on that. I do think that we will have a technologically designed future. There'll be quieter cars, cleaner cities, better carburetors. But the idea that, like on the cover of my book, there's one technocrat pulling the lever. I don't think we'll have one gigantic solution that would cool the earth suddenly like a giant volcano, or would have
Hmm.
one personality, one company, one U.S. lab. Who would set a thermostat for the world? Would it be Indonesia, the U.S., or South America? So I think that it's too much to imagine that fear would be the future.
Right. And it seems like even just from somebody like me looking at it, when you hear Elon wanting to go to Mars and continuing to focus on these types of ideas, to me, it's like, how about we try to clean up the way we do education here and the way that we treat our people here on a planet that already has a good atmosphere? And you look at like the biodome here in Arizona, it's a
Okay.
hard project. We're in a perfect environment and we can barely get that thing to work out too well. So I don't imagine a whole lot of hope in my perspective of launching ourselves up into Mars and wasting resources when we could actually implement them here on the planet and try to fix the current scenario that we're already a part of.
I think so. People want to have a vision, and the biosphere two you're referring to in Arizona.
Hmm.
Um, there are two challenges to interstellar travel. One is propulsion. Can you make a rocket that'll go at some fraction of the speed of light or something, get you there? It's long distance. And the other constraint is the biosphere. Can you make a control an environment in the spacecraft? So biosphere two is kind of like an experiment of a enclosed ecosystem that could regenerate itself. And you could imagine putting that into a space colony rocket or something where you have to recycle 99.9999% of everything, maybe more than that. And Biosphere 2, as you know, maybe your readers would like to learn more about, it didn't work. They had the bionauts had to, when they got locked in, they had to leave because of the buildup of carbon dioxide in the dome. The second try, as I understand the history, was for personal reasons. They fought with each other. So for chemical reasons and for personality differences, the two early experiments in Biosphere 2 didn't work. And now I think it's run by the University of Arizona, or I think
Hmm.
it's run by them. It's
Yep.
kind of like a drylands grouse experiments growing station, and partly
Yeah.
they have one branch I think that runs as a senior retirement village.
Mm.
So you can't say don't do that and do this, because there are things from the space age that I think benefited our world. I mean, there's things from space exploration, and just it's a very complex question. You can't just say don't spend that money on exploration and spend that money on education, because it's not a dichotomy like that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a complex thing. I just feel like one of the bigger threads that you've touched on and a lot of really deep thinkers touch on is just to be humble and to remember how complex life is and biology is, and to not it's that delusion of grandeur that seems to be the human condition that keeps getting us in the same trap. We create more mouse traps, as you said.
Well, then if you have widespread attempts at weather control, then you're not just trying to control the Earth's weather, you're trying to control manufactured weather. And people actually lose confidence in what they think is natural and what they think is given to them from the environment. So by turning the blue sky milky white using sulfates, by turning the blue ocean soupy green with iron fertilization, you would end up in many ways destroying your natural relationship with the environment, your inherited relationship.
Mm. And so, if you could give people a public, new, updated perspective of how to think about climate change, what would you do for a starting point?
It's really there's a lot has been said, a lot has been said very well. Some of it is in a sense of a repetitious. Um, the climate is changing and has always changed, but right now it's changing rapidly, and there is a large impact, a lot of large human impact from population, resource extraction, uh, transportation, energy use. AI might increase our energy profile dramatically, and humans have to think outside the box a little bit more, and they have to be more beneficent. They have to think more about the needs of their neighbors in the world rather than just their own needs. Uh, there has already been some holes poked by some famous people, like Bill Gates said, climate change is not an existential threat. This came also from the UN. There's some comments about let's not lose our cool about climate change, because a couple degrees of warming could be followed by a change in the climate. My good colleague and friend Ed Lorenz, who developed the chaos theory idea, he didn't just write about weather control or weather changes. He wrote about climate changes. And Lorenz said that a scientist trying to study climate should look at the internal fluctuations of the climate system as well as outside forces. So we're adding the outside forces. I think we should have a minimal impact, but I don't think we should become sort of Cassandras about it.
Right. Yeah, there's a thing you've heard of, the tragedy of the commons, where if we don't do it, then they're going to do it. So it feels like this race for people, especially in the short term. And that seems to be one of the things propelling us into the future in this way, where we're not usually using self-constraint.
There was what I called a weather race with the Russians in the 50s and 60s. The U.S. thought that the Russians had many more meteorologists than we have. They thought they were probably going to control the climate, and they thought that we better hurry up and try to figure out how to do it.
Mm.
Racing, I mean, you mentioned the Olympics. We're currently in some playoff football era right now. I think competition is part of the human condition, but I also think it's not just a race to beat another nation toward a goal. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And I know, as a historian of just science in general, are there some key lessons that you've learned as you've explored that subject?
Yeah, right. It's not all. I mean, the scientists. A lot of people talk about the genius factor, thinking about things that nobody had ever thought about. But science develops kind of in a branching out kind of way. There's a lot of things that happen. There's a lot of developments in society and technology that prefigure a great idea. And scientists are human. I mean, that's part of the big message. The scientists are human. They have all the qualities and limitations of humans, and it's not just a history of ideas. The history of science is a history in some ways, interconnected, in some other ways, an entangled situation where you have to have like the right moment and the right idea and the right team. Now, oftentimes, things are developed in sequence, parallel in different parts of the world, and somebody gets credit. And so
Mm.
history of science has become much more about the society, the economy, the context, and not just about the individual genius.
Yeah. And one of the things I always think about is that history is, there's a lot of shaping of it, the engineering of how we view history. So which books are left in and which ones are burned. And right now, with AI and online censorship and different people with centralized power, sometimes I get led to the social engineering component of it, like how many people want to shape the way that we view history. So if I ask ChatGPT versus Grok versus doing my own research, you're going to get three different perspectives. And so the young generation coming up, sometimes I'm concerned with the elimination of the history, or the persuasion of viewing history in a certain context.
And oversimplification too. You pick one of those chatbots and you ask a question, and you might assume that that's that.
Mm-hmm.
So I lived during a period of transition. I mean, it was, as they said when Adam and Eve left the garden, it was a time of transition, and my transition was from a lot of library research, paper books, dictionaries, encyclopedias, to online.
Mm-hmm.
We always used to say publish or perish, and then we started to say post or perish, and now we kind of say post and perish. No, but the modern reader wants to have things digitally.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about the current technologies that are being deployed and used to shape the weather? Say, I always hear about nanoparticles to block and reflect the sun, that Bill Gates is involved in a certain company, and other companies are trying to pump the sky full of liquid nano, some sort of particle, aluminum particle, and then they charge it. You charge it up, I guess, supposedly. I don't know if this is true. And then you try to make it dump, or you try to, what is your perspective on the current geoengineering and some of the things that you're hearing about?
Well, because of my credentials in atmospheric science, I was invited into a number of these very high level scientific meetings that didn't have much sense of history. The first one was in 2006 at
Hmm.
the Silomar campus of NASA Ames on the West Coast. And there, one of Gates's proteges, who had developed part of the SDI system, he said, "Well, you atmospheric scientists are a lot dumber than the nuclear scientists, and so we already solved this problem with nanoparticles. We make particles that don't make the sky milky white; they retain the blueness of the sky, but they redirect the sunlight away from the Earth." And I still have a copy of his paper. It was called "Pump It Up, Spew It Out," using a high altitude aerial balloon, which was not yet developed. You would put a gigantic hose about 12 kilometers up into the atmosphere attached to a balloon and just
Wow.
spray this stuff out. And you could get the attractive thing is, especially for people like Gates, is that you could get a patent on those things. And you could be the only one that would hold the patent for global cooling. The fellow never thought he was really smart, but he never thought about how the hose might ice up. He never thought about how the balloon might drift and detach the hose. And so the scenario became this gigantic, relatively, long, I would say phallic shaped hose whipping around and falling back down to the earth as a total failure in this experiment. It was never done, but the notion that you could patent techniques for breaking up hurricanes, you could patent these nanoparticles. What would happen when they fall back to Earth? Nobody thought about that.
Yeah.
Uh, I think the other theme in my fixing the sky book is the proprietary. The There's military interest, but there's also commercial interest, and a lot of these people are very successful, as you mentioned, billionaires who want to make more billions by patenting their techniques.
Hmm.
So I have a strong. I'm looking at sort of governance and ethics too, and I have a pretty strong feeling that these things shouldn't be patented. They shouldn't be proprietary techniques, not when you're dealing with the global commons. And you mentioned Garrett Hardin and the tragedy of the commons. You shouldn't try to make megabucks out of your own technique, and you should and people don't even think much about the unintended consequences.
Yeah. And I think the frustrating thing for most people, they see this as going on and there's nothing that we can do about it. The frustration of that when you look at the sky, or you hear these stories about someone buying up all the farmland or spraying the skies with aluminum particles and wondering what the downfall of that will be. And it's like, well, shit, what do you do about that? And it
Mhm.
is frustrating. It is one of the truthful, dark, shady things of our time. I'm an optimist myself, but it still pisses me off.
There are fears, and then there are some unallayed fears, and then there are some probably things that you shouldn't really fear. And
Hmm.
sorting all those things out, I had a meeting in the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and our panel was a bunch of climate engineers and me on the inside giving talks at the meeting, and on the outside there were these chemtrails protesters, and they were saying, "Don't make us sick, and don't put the poison in our skies, and these contrails are killing us." And I remember we had a very large press conference after the meeting, and I remember I still believe this. I said, "I don't know who's a little nuttier, the people on the inside panel or the people outside protesting." So they were both dealing with issues that were too large to be resolved, and some of the chemtrails people were hypochondriacs. So when they saw a jet contrail, they would get sick. They would
Hmm.
go into their room and close the windows, and it would be psychologically devastating in a kind of a hypochondriac way. And with the climate engineers, a lot of them want to play savior for the planet
Right.
and simple ideas. There are sincere environmentalists in this area, but many of them are not deep enough in climate science. I don't think they're not. The best thing we could do, I think, is to make better understanding of the atmosphere, better forecasting of the future, better monitoring of the thing, not just manipulation. So we go from understanding, which is not very deep, to prediction, which is not very precise, to control, which are sort of Rube Goldberg type ideas on how to cool the planet.
Yeah. There was a woman I read on your blog, Joanna Simpson. Is
Joanne
that,
Simpson, I just wrote a book about her.
yeah, can you speak just a little bit to why you would spend so much time writing a book about such a character? Who was she?
Joanne Simpson was a highly educated um, iconoclast. She was raised in Cambridge, Mass. Her father was the aviation reporter for the Boston Herald. Her mother was a wannabe journalist who couldn't do her journalism because of her children. And Joanne was targeted to go to Radcliffe and probably studied the humanities. And she rebelled. She said, I'm not going to stay around here. I'm going to Chicago to study meteorology. This was in 1943. And, and in Chicago, she ran across Carl Gustav Rossby, who was one of the most famous meteorologists of the 20th century. And she began teaching the war effort weather cadets. She was teaching at NYU, and she wanted to teach in Chicago, but was not able to because her husband was on the Chicago faculty. And her story is one of hardship, upward mobility, but in a man's world, I mean, lots of abuse. She ended up at Woods Hole as a principal investigator on an aircraft where before that no men had ever been the principal investigators. And she had her pilot's license and was able to fly in clouds and study clouds and collect particles from clouds, and became the leading tropical meteorologist of her era. She
Hmm.
died in 2010, but she's definitely a legend. She didn't find a traditional academic job that she was happy with, although she was given some major plum positions at different universities. It just didn't work out. But at NASA, she got her own satellite, or she got in charge of the tropical rainfall measuring mission. And the tropics cover half the globe and half of the world's population, and typically a poorer population than the northern tier. And they're subject to droughts and floods and severe storms. And she developed, again, the instrument was a downward looking radar in space that went around the world and showed how the storms were developing. It flew more years than it was designed to fly, and now they have a new program like that called the Global Precipitation Measurement Satellites.
Wow.
She she uh, she came out of a sort of a broken family in Cambridge, where they had plans for her, and she just took off. And even though she had two husbands that didn't treat her very well, the third one was great. She ended up at the top of her field, and why did I do that? I mean, I had met her in her old age. I met her about 2005, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. She's a nice person. She did a lot of work, but then I learned that she had developed this archive at Harvard, the exceptional woman in science. It was not just women in science. She was designated an exceptional woman by Radcliffe Institute, and her papers were just so clearly organized, and I could come in there and begin to interpret her life and made a book out of it. And she was
Wow.
also the connection here with weather control. She was one of the principals in the Project Storm Fury, which was to try to study hurricanes. And one of their goals was to see how hurricanes work, do some experiments on them with silver iodide, see if it would change anything about them. But then the Navy came in with their equipment and their personnel, and the Navy wanted to control hurricanes. They wanted to weaponize them. They wanted to direct the hurricanes against enemy fleets, etc. And so there's this a very interesting
Hmm.
contrast between the scientists who wanted to understand how nature works and the militarists who wanted nature to work for them.
Wow.
And it made a nice story. So
That's awesome.
that was
And
my
what are you writing now, or what are you currently working on, focused on?
oh my I'm getting that's a really wonderful question. I'm getting a lot of messages about an update to fixing the sky,
Oh, okay.
and it's been 15 years since the book came out. The dynamics are pretty much similar, but there are new actors, there are new
Mm-hmm.
ideas, and I'm thinking of taking kind of the core message of this book and adding to it from the past 15 years. I
Mm.
have a couple other projects on the back burner. One, which, since you asked, is about the so called genre of big history. Big history, which developed in the 90s, claims to be a universal message, and it's also funded by Bill Gates for middle school kids. It tends to talk about from the Big Bang to the current moment and how that all works together. It tends
Mm.
to have 85% of it is part physics and geology and anthropology, and there are very few humans in the story. And I just gave a talk in November on this. I playfully said I'm going to try to write a bigger big history, which is the histories of all the different cultures and how they thought about the universe, and
Oh,
how would you write a big history, say in the time of before Darwin's origin. How would you write a big history without evolution? How would you write a big history without nuclear synthesis? How would you write a big history before Copernicus? And I'm
dang.
thinking of little chapters that
Yeah.
show what big history would look like in different eras and in different
Wow.
countries.
That
That's
sounds like
a
a,
big
a hell
project.
of a project.
I think the only way for me to do it would be to pitch it as a graduate seminar here at the university and have different students take different shots at different sections of it. Give
Yeah.
them the picture, but let somebody go in. I had one student who was an art major, and she was very smart because I was doing this thing about what would history look like, what would this big history look like at the time of, uh, of Copernicus. And she says, "Well, what about other cultures too?" And she drew she painted a series of paintings on what the Big Bang today would look like if she read other cultures and tried to paint that painting of the origin story, whether
Wow.
South American or
Yeah.
Australian, indigenous. And so there's a turn that goes from Western culture to world cultures,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really quite a challenging project. So I have one revision project and one new project in mind.
That's amazing. That sounds like a heck of a project. I love reading like epistemology, like Will Durant's books, The Story of Philosophy. But then later in his life, he even started to do the same thing where he's like, well, wait a minute, I've been so focused on the West. And he started to go more Eastern and started to look from different vantage points. And I think it's so important to do that. So,
Yeah, and I'm sort of embedded in that. I have a lot of Asian roots in my family, and some world. I'm not an expert in that, but I would try to distribute it. Get away from
mhm.
the this is my book kind of thing, and make it more of a cooperative thing.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Well, I've had you for an hour. If you were going to die today, this was the last thing you could say to the world. What would you want to share with the world?
Oh my goodness, what a question! Share with the world.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just say thank you. It's been a good ride. I mean, I tried and carry on. You know, I wouldn't do it about me. I would do it about keep your chin up, aim high, look forward. I once gave the Phi Beta Kappa group at my college, Colby College, asked me to give a, you know, what would you want to tell the students who are getting these degrees next week?
Mm-hmm.
And I just shared some of my mottos, which is involved in the simplified things like aim high. But there was one where everything. I have a motto I use all the time. It's called "Everything is unprecedented if you don't study history." When you hear about these unprecedented challenges, you know, it makes some sense to look at the past, study the past, uh, live in the present, but you know, prepare for the future.
That's a beautiful message. I love that. Yeah, I appreciate your time today. It's been really fun chatting with you, so I appreciate
Well,
that.
Ryan, you're a very good interviewer, and I appreciate your inviting me to this. It was a,
Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it and subscribe to the show and rate the show. That helps people to discover it. And enjoy the next episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination of some sort.